And we're really delighted to have all of you here today. What you'll hear today is an overview of a new free tool that's available in the Bay Area. It's called the Mitigation Wizard. So today's agenda. First, welcome everybody. We'd love to know who's here. So please in the chat, list your name, your organization, and what is your favorite Bay Area park. So please go ahead and open up the chat now. And let's see what you see. Let's see what you have. While we're doing that, I'll go through the rest of the agenda. We'll go through the mitigation goals, purpose, and background. I'll do that, and Kim from Green Info Network will also join in. Then we'll have a break for questions and discussion. And again, we'll use the chat. Then Jody and Carrie will give a demonstration or a test drive of the Mitigation Wizard with an example so you can see how it works. Then we'll have another session break for questions and discussion. And then to close it out, we'll go through training sessions and how you can learn more. Seeing some really great examples in the chat. Tilden, Regional Park, Pescadero State Park, Tennessee Valley, Ring Mountain. This is fantastic. Austin Creek, we are really lucky to have such beautiful areas in the Bay Area. Okay, next slide. So what's the problem we're trying to solve with the Mitigation Wizard? It's been well documented that traditional or unplanned mitigation can be ineffective and expensive. It can be risky and it can be difficult to locate and secure. And that's not just for the infrastructure agencies or developers that are trying to secure mitigation, it's also for conservation. Often what we've seen, kind of the classic example of ineffective mitigation, is habitat within a cloverleaf. And from a conservation perspective, what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at a landscape scale approach to mitigation that aligns with regional conservation priorities and co-benefits, is implemented in advance, and doesn't end up with piecemeal mitigation. When that is done, it's a lot more rational, it's a lot more thought out, and it also helps infrastructure agencies because their projects are not delayed by mitigation, especially if it's done in advance. Another classic problem that we have sought to solve through the Mitigation Wizard is data. So data is very difficult to access, and it's also difficult and complicated to really implement and integrate into solutions. So what we thought would be helpful is if we created a tool to help achieve that. Next slide. So this landscape scale approach in advance is often called RAMP, Regional Advance Mitigation Planning. This is a policy and approach that has been implemented in places in California, as well as in places around the country. And the goal of RAMP is to align the mitigation hierarchy and conservation priorities to achieve meaningful conservation outcomes and expedite project delivery. It's both and rather than either or. So it aims to save time and money for both the infrastructure agencies and conservation organizations. It aims to improve conservation outcomes and infrastructure delivery outcomes. It aims to reduce risk both to the infrastructure agencies, but also to the conservation goals, in that if you implement conservation or mitigation in a landscape scale in advance, you reduce risk to the projects. And it also is important to foster communication and collaboration, not just among the agencies, but also with the public. Next slide. So there's been an interest in implementing RAMP in the Bay Area. And the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Coastal Conservancy have been co-sponsoring an effort facilitated by the Nature Conservancy in the Bay Area to implement RAMP at a regional scale. We list the Technical Advisory Committee here because we used this committee, this TAC, to develop the Mitigation Wizard. It was really important for us to have users at the table. And so entities and organizations like these have been helpful in telling us what would be most useful to them. Next slide. Here's an example of the methodology for RAMP. And I'll walk through this fairly quickly, but I think it will help to understand why we built the Mitigation Wizard. So on the left side, you can see that the first step is to identify regional conservation values and priorities. That includes species and habitats that will need mitigation or are sensitive species that are subject to mitigation. But it also includes conservation values and priorities such as conservation plans that are in existence, other conservation goals or elements like habitat connectivity, groundwater recharge, carbon sequestration. So you see what we call mitigation supply, but there's also an element of identifying co-benefits. The next map is a map of planned transportation projects in the Bay Area, and this is from Plan Bay Area. So you can see points when there are maybe interchanges or single projects or lines which are expansions of transportation projects, like capacity inducing or capacity expanding projects. The third map from the left is where you can take the planned transportation projects and overlay them on the habitats and species map. And you can therefore identify potential impacts to habitats and species, and then identify potential mitigation needs to habitats and species. And then once you know that, you can then identify the appropriate mitigation sites that meet both the mitigation needs and requirements, but also help identify co-benefits. Next slide. So what about these co-benefits? How do we know where they are? Well, we're lucky in the Bay Area, there's a free tool called the Bay Area Greenprint. You can access it by going to bayareagreenprint.org. This is a tool that has been developed by partners in the Bay Area, completely free, easy to access, no barrier to entry, there's no sign up. And the Bay Area Greenprint seeks to identify and surface to users the conservation, the nature's values and benefits throughout the Bay Area. And it's organized by nature's values and benefits. And those include things like on the screen. So for example, recreation, habitats and species, habitat connectivity, air quality, water supply, water quality, carbon sequestration, agricultural economic impact. And we sought to bridge both the RAMP methodology and the species and conservation data that exists in the Bay Area with the Bay Area Greenprint to also incorporate co-benefits. And that's to capture the idea that $1 invested in mitigation could achieve the goals of mitigation, which is to protect species and habitats, but it can also leverage other co-benefits like groundwater recharge or carbon sequestration. So next slide. So bridging both the data that we have for mitigation and the Bay Area Greenprint, we created the Mitigation Wizard. The goals of the Mitigation Wizard are first to enable Regional Advance Mitigation Planning, and that was really the first driver to create the Mitigation Wizard and to put that in the hands of users rather than in hands of GIS experts or others. Second, we wanted to make it easier to follow the mitigation hierarchy, and that is avoiding first. If you can't avoid impacts, then you minimize impacts. And if you still have impacts that you cannot avoid or minimize, to then compensate for those impacts. We wanted to make it easier for information to be surfaced so that if a developer or an infrastructure agency sees that their project is going to have a lot of impacts, maybe they can do things to avoid it and minimize it sooner, earlier in the process. Third, the Mitigation Wizard seeks to guide mitigation investments to more effectively support conservation priorities and multi-benefit outcomes. It also seeks to increase support for projects, both conservation projects and infrastructure projects. If the infrastructure projects successfully avoid and minimize impacts, and if they drive mitigation dollars to conservation priorities, there can be better support for those projects. And finally, we wanted to democratize the data. We wanted to put this information in this tool in the hands of users to make it very, very easy to access. Next slide. So that's why we created the Mitigation Wizard. I'm just going to walk through these words, and then we'll go to the tool on screen. So the Mitigation Wizard is a web application accessible through the Bay Area Greenprint. It provides an early screen for species that might require mitigation based on potential project impacts. It maps areas that are likely to have habitat for impacted species within the search parameters identified by the user. It displays heat maps of regional priorities and co-benefits in those areas to help inform mitigation planning. And it provides information on the mitigation potential and co-benefits of user-selected sites. So those are a lot of words, but here's what it looks like on screen. Next slide. This is it. This is the landing page. It's through the Bay Area Greenprint. And next I'm going to turn to Kim, who will walk through the specific features of the Mitigation Wizard, and then we'll pause for a few questions. Kim, you're up.
All right. Next slide. The Mitigation Wizard lives in the Bay Area Greenprint site. This allows your final report to seamlessly open in the Greenprint tool. Now, we'll go over key steps used in the Mitigation Wizard to find the predicted impacts on species and habitats based on the defined project area. And then we'll review options to refine the mitigation opportunities for those impacts. And finally, we'll go over the iteration and reporting of those results. The first step in using this tool is to define the project area. You can define the project area by either dropping a pointer line and then adding a buffer, drawing a polygon, uploading a shapefile, or selecting an area from the drop-down menu. If you don't already know your project impacts, they can be estimated after the project area is defined using one out of the 3 species models provided. You can then select which species to focus on and their mitigation ratio. Then you'll be able to find mitigation opportunities by either using the tool's default settings or by customizing the tool settings based on your needs. For example, you can select to either protect existing habitat or restore habitat. You can then select between 3 different species models to search for mitigation opportunities. Next, you're able to decide where to seek mitigation, such as within a certain distance from the project area, or within a watershed, county, etc. You can continue to customize your mitigation opportunities by toggling your preferences of the filters available. Preferences of mitigating protected or unprotected lands, specifying land cover type, critical linkages, regional connectivity, and other factors. For example, for the filter regional connectivity, your search can be limited to those that represent the last natural linkages, or limited to areas with the highest density of conservation priorities. Finally, you can download a report, save a link of your customized settings to share with others, export the results, or open them in the Greenprint.
Okay, well, that was a really quick step-by-step. You probably have questions, so now we're going to pause for a minute. Please submit your questions in the chat box, and we'll read them and attempt to answer them. We'll also go through a demonstration. So if you don't have questions now, we still have an opportunity for questions a little bit later. Okay, the first question. Are the mitigation options limited to habitat acquisition? No, the mitigation options also include restoration opportunities. I'm also going to open up in case Kim or Jody or Carrie have comments. Next question. Does this work at the residential project scale, say for a small wetland? I'm going to go to Jody for that answer.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's a great question. We worked really hard to try to make the scale of the analysis relevant to even some of the smaller projects. In fact, we started with a larger for planning unit and got it down to 25 acres. So, you know, while maybe the smallest projects, it might be a little bit core scale, we do think it's a great tool to start your analysis, and then maybe folks might have to find some finer scale site level information or spatial data to help augment that initial screening. But we do think it can help screen for those initial projects, at least initially.
Great. Next question. Will the model also track completed mitigation? Jody, maybe you can answer that one too.
Sorry, I missed that one, Liz. So
sorry, will the model also track completed mitigation?
Oh gosh, no, I don't think the model is planning to it actually has current conservation protected lands in it, but it wouldn't be anticipated to be used as a tracking tool.
And as part of the integration with the Bay Area Greenprint, we have the protected areas database. And so if the mitigation is completed and then goes into that database, then it would track it, but it wouldn't track it per se as mitigation. Okay, next question. Have the regulatory agencies who may require compensatory mitigation as conditions of their permits provided input to the wizard? Yes, we tried very hard and we did. So through the Bay Area RAMP TAC, which included California Department of Fish and Wildlife, NOAA Fisheries, and I see that a number of our advisors are on this webinar today. The Army Corps, EPA, US Fish and Wildlife Service, the Water Board, BCDC, were all entities and representatives provided feedback. And so there was a lot of iteration of what information, what data, at what scale, and for what use. We spent a good 6 months iterating. So yes, we're delighted that they were part of this, and we really thank them for that. Okay, next question. Does the tool identify approved mitigation banks available based on the projects being within their service area or HCPs nearby? There is information through the Greenprint on HCPs. I don't know about approved mitigation banks. Does the team know? Jody?
No, I don't think we track that.
How does this relate or does it link to the EcoAtlas? Wetland Tracker was integrated into EcoAtlas and does track mitigation status towards completion. Does Jody or Carrie have the answer to that one?
I'll defer to Carrie. I mean, I think we did work with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to integrate some of the data from EcoAtlas, but we largely built off the spatial data that was developed for the Bay Area RAMP project, which is a little bit more focused. EcoAtlas has mostly statewide data sets, is my understanding, and the Bay Area RAMP data sets are more focused on the 9 Bay Area counties. So we think they have a little bit more precision and higher, more data available for that that we were able to bring to bear to this tool.
Also, through the Bay Area Greenprint, there are links to tools like EcoAtlas. And so what we hope to create through the Bay Area Greenprint is a one-stop shop for conservation user needs. And we integrated a lot of the work into that. Next question, does your answer about iteration mean that all those agencies will accept the mitigation site? No. You still have to go through the process for mitigation. But what we tried to do is we tried to create a tool that represented the information that the agencies sought and needed and said would be required, but it in no way says that whatever you choose through the Mitigation Wizard will be accepted by them. All the regulatory requirements and collaboration needs exist. Next question. Will this be a living application open to input from regulatory agencies as desired mitigation opportunities become apparent or available? Yeah, so this application is definitely open to input from regulatory agencies. One example is that the current information on wetlands that's in there right now needs a little bit more refinement based on the feedback we got from regulatory agencies. And so we have on our list of things to do to refine the wetlands data over the next couple months. That said, it is being funded by a funder with defined and limited funding levels. So if we run out of funding, we won't be able to make improvements. However, I do believe that that we're in a really good place, and as it becomes used, and we absolutely want your feedback, that it can become a going concern and integrated into the Greenprint, which will also leverage that data and those funding sources. So yes, please give us feedback. Okay, let's move on to the demonstration.
All right. So as Liz mentioned, the Mitigation Wizard lives in the Bay Area Greenprint, so you can access it. One of the ways is through this dashboard. So we'll open up the Mitigation Wizard, and for this demonstration, I'm going to be going back and forth with Jody McGraw. And Jody, maybe you could tell a little bit about the project that you have in mind that we'll explore in the Mitigation Wizard.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carrie. So I've been working with transportation and conservation agencies in Santa Clara County on RAMP, trying to put the practices and policies that Liz mentioned and outlined at the beginning of the presentation into practice in this county, which has recently developed a regional conservation investment strategy and also has a very effective habitat conservation plan and natural communities conservation plan. And so what I thought we could do as part of our demonstration today would be to take a look at a couple of the transportation projects identified in Plan Bay Area for Santa Clara County and see what mitigation opportunities might be available to mitigate those, and also identify kind of key opportunities to leverage conservation actions in Santa Clara County that have been identified. So those projects I was thinking would be helpful would be the high-speed rail project that's going to go through the southern and western portions of Santa Clara County. And also VTA, the Valley Transit Authority, has a interchange project at Highway 101 and Highway 120, or Highway 101 and Highway 25. So if we could take a look at the impacts of those projects and collectively as part of a RAMP process and figure out what mitigation we can bring to bear for those, that would be great.
Great. So the first decision point in the Mitigation Wizard is to either identify project impacts or to just enter them by species and acres. But it sounds like you have projects in mind, and we want to see what the impacts might be. So here, we'll define those project areas. There's a couple of ways that we can do it. One is we can draw a point or a line on the map and buffer it, or draw a polygon. If we have a general idea, we can use the map, or we can upload a shapefile. But we also have all of the Plan Bay Area transportation projects preloaded in the tool. So in this case, since both of those projects are in Plan Bay Area, we can just go select them. So they're drawn on the map. And one way is you could just click on them in order to choose it. So if we want the high-speed rail alignment, we could just click on it here. Oops. It's a little narrow for me to click on, but we can also just go select it. They're all listed with their project number and project name by county, so we can easily just find those two projects. And here's the Highway 101-25 interchange, so we'll add that to the list. And then we'll go back and select high-speed rail as well. And if anyone sees it before I do, just let me know. There we go. Okay, I see that.
California, yeah.
So now we have our two projects here, and now we can select our models, so we can have a more constrained model that might underestimate impacts, or a less constrained model which will find more impact. In this case, that's the default. That way we don't miss anything in this first cut, and we'll click Find Impacts.
And just to clarify what tool is looking, you mean models, species models, right? And models for identifying where species might be located, rare species?
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right, so the tool has found modeled habitat impacts in these for these two projects. Do you want to take a look at what you see? And these are the estimated impacts in acres. And let me know if anything looks off, because we have the ability to edit and adjust any of the acreage.
Okay, great. We did some preliminary assessments, and I think that the foothill yellow-legged frog acreage maybe looks a little bit high. So for purposes of this analysis, maybe we could drop that down to about 100 acres.
Sounds good. All right, we'll scroll through the others. The other option we have here is to adjust the mitigation ratios. So if the acres all look right, the other opportunity we have is, if we know that mitigation ratios are 1-to-1, we can leave it as 1-to-1, which is the default, or we can adjust on a species by species basis those mitigation ratios. Are there any ratios that you'd like to adjust?
Yeah, let's go ahead, and that's great that we have that opportunity. Let's go ahead and increase the ratio for the wetland communities to 4-to-1.
Okay. Everything else looks okay for?
Yeah, it seems good for initial screening. That sounds good.
Okay, so now we can select mitigation opportunities. So first, our option is to either protect existing habitat or to create or restore habitat. Do you have an idea of what you're looking for?
Yeah, for that large suite of species and resources that we need to mitigate for, I think we'll want to look at the option to protect existing habitat, but I might come back through later on and look and see about specific opportunities to create and restore habitat for the wetlands. But for now, let's just start with the protect existing habitat.
That sounds good. And here, again, we have an option to choose species models in which to search for mitigation sites. And here we might want to choose the more constrained model, so we can be more certain that the species will actually be on the sites that we're looking for, since this is just modeled habitat at this point.
That sounds great.
Okay, so find mitigation opportunities. And while it's searching, right now we're searching Bay Area wide. But next we have the opportunity to choose a mitigation location. So likely we're not going to be selecting mitigation across the whole Bay Area. Let me zoom out so you can see that we actually have selected sites everywhere. They're just still drawing. But what we can do is, more realistically, where might you be searching for mitigation?
Yeah, great question. Since our impacts are in Santa Clara County, maybe we can constrain our filter the analysis to just Santa Clara County.
Great. So we'll select county, and we'll select Santa Clara. And now we will update the mitigation opportunities just to those areas. So before we look at the rest of the filters, let's take a look at how we're doing at meeting our mitigation need. So here, we can see that we've well exceeded our goal for all of our species. So we can probably narrow down our mitigation search now and not include all areas in the county. So we can have like a more refined search, because we've met all the mitigation needs for all of our species. So the first thing is whether we're looking on all lands or just protected lands or just unprotected lands?
Yeah, so since we want to focus at least initially on protecting new habitat, let's go ahead and filter for just the unprotected lands for now.
Great. The next option we have is to filter by certain land cover types. So we can check on and off certain land cover types to further narrow in what we're looking for.
I can see that that would be really helpful for if we had like a species or a couple species, but since we have a kind of a full suite of diverse species using all the land cover types, let's leave them all checked for now.
Great. Another option is to just search for mitigation opportunities within Bay Area critical linkages. So these would be opportunities that meet mitigation needs, but are also within corridors for habitat connectivity for some species. Is that desirable?
Yeah, I think our transportation and conservation partners in Santa Clara are really keenly interested in trying to maintain connectivity in the area. So let's go ahead and select for just see what we can get from a habitat that's just within the Bay Area Critical Linkages Project linkages.
Great. What we can also do, the map that we're viewing now shows conservation plan density. So as Liz mentioned before, we're trying to see where mitigation can be met, but also where mitigation can help advance other regional priorities or achieve other co-benefits. So these areas in darker purple have been prioritized by conservation plans or achieve other co-benefits. Would you like to filter to just these areas with higher possibility of advancing conservation plans and achieving co-benefits?
Definitely. We want to work on a really multi-benefited way out there and achieve as many goals as possible. So if we can maybe dial that up so that we have, I don't know, let's start with maybe 50% or 50, I guess, percent of the plans present. Cool.
This next filter, habitat coverage, the planning units that we use are about 25 acres. And so by coverage, we mean how much of that planning unit is actually covered by habitat for one of the species in your search. So right now, we're identifying planning units, even if there's just 1 acre of habitat. So here we could dial that up. So we just capture planning units that have a higher proportion of habitat within them.
Yeah,
would you like to dial that up?
Yeah, sure. Let's go for 50 as well, again, to be a little bit more efficient in our conservation solution. We can be more focused.
Great. Species richness is a filter that helps us identify which planning units have multiple species that require mitigation for your projects. So the higher we have, the more species that will be found in that planning unit. Would you like to search for species-rich planning units?
Yeah, that seems, again, like another opportunity to focus on the biggest bang for our buck with this solution.
Should we go to about 50% for that too?
That sounds good for starters.
And habitat rarity helps us identify those planning units that have the least broadly distributed species. So some species may be found in a lot of planning units, whereas some species may be only found in a couple, and this helps us narrow in on those more restricted range species. So that way we're finding those specific planning units that are necessary in order to get all of our mitigation needs met.
Great, that seems like another opportunity to be really focused. So let's maybe put that up to 50 for starters.
All right. So we'll update our mitigation search. And we'll take a look at the species, and it looks like we're still meeting all of our goals. We're capturing less habitat, you can see that here. But even with this smaller number of sites, we're still achieving the mitigation need. We're beyond the mitigation need for a lot of these species. Let me see if I can increase the, is that better? I saw that there's small letters on the screen share, so hopefully that's helpful. And what we have listed here is the species names and then a bar chart showing how much of the goal is met by these mitigation sites.
Hey, Carrie, can you clarify the green bars versus the blue bars for me again?
Yeah, so the green bars are what is needed.
Got it.
And the blue bar is what's found in these mitigation sites.
Okay.
So we only need 79 acres, but we've found almost 10,000 acres of habitat.
Got it. So if
so
we don't
we
see
can
the green bars, then it's because they're really small relative to how much mitigation opportunity or inventory we have, right?
Exactly.
Great.
So we can probably keep dialing in our filters to see if we can continue to narrow our search to really hone in on some of these mitigation sites.
All right. Maybe increase them to 75% or?
Yeah. So which one would you like to increase?
How about the conservation plan density? Seems like having plan areas that have been identified in more plans would be great for meeting the regulatory agencies and other conservation partners' needs.
Great.
Recovery plans and HCPs and everything else.
We'll take a look back. This is part of the iteration. So it looks like we've lost some of the, we needed an acre of leaf Bell's vireo habitat, and we no longer are achieving that. So part of iterating is we can dial this down again, maybe, and see if we can capture it again while still narrowing. So I moved it down to 65. And we'll take a look at what we're achieving, and it looks like we again have habitat for leaf Bell's vireo in our search.
Great.
Another way that we might be able to narrow the search is by going back up and taking a look at our at the location where we're searching for mitigation. Instead of searching county-wide, would you like to think about narrowing that search?
Yeah, good call. It looks like there's really good opportunities along the alignment for the high-speed rail, which is also near the interchange. So maybe we could have it be within, say, 5 miles of the project area. We don't want it right in the project area because it's probably going to be more fragmented, but within 5 miles, if we can focus the search there, that might be more acceptable from meeting the like needs of the mitigation.
So here I've selected near to project areas instead of county-wide, and that's this blue area has selected a 5-mile buffer. There's also opportunities to really narrow that, but it sounded like 5 miles would be a good search at this point. So then we'll update, click Find Mitigation Opportunities, and you'll notice that the mitigation opportunities over here in this part of the county have gone away since we're just looking within this buffered corridor, and we can scroll back down and see how we're doing against our goals. So we still have met the goals, but you can see these green bars a little better because we're actually getting closer and closer to what the actual mitigation need might be. Would you like to do any more adjusting, or should we think about some of the reporting options at this point?
Yeah, reporting options are great. I think at this point, we'd also want to be able to take a look at it, kind of like parcel ownership and the land ownership patterns, and think about what opportunities exist more strategically. So let's move on from here. We got it down to a nice set of areas, it looks like.
All right. So in addition to getting the reporting on the species and how you're doing against your mitigation needs, we also compare the project impact area to the filtered mitigation areas. So those sites that we've selected as a whole, in terms of how much land is protected or not. So as you can see, we're not capturing protected land because we filtered that out at the start. But we can see what the composition is of land cover. So we have a lot of herbaceous areas and hardwood woodland. We're capturing a lot of regional connectivity, and we have high conservation plan density by design since we set that up as a filter, and 100% of our places are within a linkage for Bay Area critical linkages, and we can see what the composition of the sites are. And then there's a number of ways to get this information out of the tool. We can download a PDF to get this report. We can download an Excel file that shows, that has attributes for each of the hexagons or each of the planning units and what species and how many acres of habitat are in there. We can download the shape file, which includes both the project impact shapes, but also the shapes for the mitigation sites that were selected. We can click share, which will create a link so we can get back to this same place again. So I'll click on that. So we'll have that link. And then the other thing we can do is click open in the Greenprint. And this will send those planning units that we narrowed in on and selected into the Greenprint for a search for potential co-benefits.
Great.
So we can name our report and send it to the Greenprint. All right, so here are the sites we selected. So not only can we now view these in the context of all the different map layers in the Bay Area Greenprint, but we've also already run a report to figure out all the different co-benefits that are inside these planning units, all combined as a whole. So we've selected over 3,000 acres in Santa Clara County. So that's a lot of sites, but this is just a preliminary screen, and we'd probably do more iteration and more refinement of our filters to get it more close to a site size that we're looking for. And then we can kind of look across all of the different themes. So in biodiversity and habitat, we see that we have about 3,000 acres of conservation land network priority land. And that's somewhat by design because we filtered to conservation plan density, and the conservation lands network is a regional conservation plan that is built into our conservation plan density layer. And then in habitat connectivity, we see that over 3,000 acres are part of Bay Area critical linkages, and that was also by design because if you remember, we included that filter to just look for mitigation sites within these linkages. And we can open that on the map so we can see what that looks like. So you can see within these linkages is where our sites are being located.
Right.
And lastly, this is a hotspot of species that are requiring compensatory mitigation. So we did dial up species richness, but that was just for species that required mitigation for these two projects. This is showing that it actually has habitat for species Bay Area wide. Other species that might require mitigation are also on this site.
Great.
Then we can look at our water resources and see that there's 1,600 acre feet of groundwater recharge in this area, and it's equivalent to the amount of annual water use for over 8,000 households. So these sites are also important for groundwater recharge. We can also see that this area has some acres in the floodplain, and that helps to add to resilience to flood waters. This area also has some carbon storage, so avoiding disturbance in this area would be equivalent to getting over 14,000 passenger vehicles driven for 1 year off the road. And so there's definitely some carbon mitigation benefits to protecting these areas.
Great.
There's also
these multiple benefits are really helpful. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
The last thing I was just going to share is that there's benefit also to air quality. So the natural lands in these sites are responsible for sequestering both PM 2.5 and nitrogen dioxide out of the air.
That's all great information to have for the conservation agencies, to work with transportation agencies to identify the sort of best conservation as well as mitigation opportunities.
Great. So I think at that point, that ends our test drive. So I'll go back over to the presentation. Do you want to share some additional use cases?
Right. So just, developing, just wanted to highlight some of the other, we kind of walked through the primary use case that the tool was developed, identifying project impacts and identifying mitigation for those impacts. But there are a lot of other ways that agencies and organizations can use the tool for citing and designing projects and their mitigation, as well as just conservation independent of any kind of project impacts. On the mitigation side of things, the tool can be really helpful to help design projects to avoid impacts or at least minimize them. So people can upload shape files for their project areas or draw them on the map and figure out maybe areas where they could be, if there's an opportunity to recite things to minimize impacts. It can also just be used to figure out the mitigation inventory, as it were, the sort of amount of mitigation that could be in an area without even assessing impacts. You don't have to have a project. If you're just looking for potential mitigation areas, you can use it just to delineate those and find out what mitigation is available. You can also, of course, develop different scenarios, different project scenarios, like we talked about with the minimizing impacts, or also just different mitigation opportunities, and generate reports to cross-compare them for both their mitigation value and their co-benefits, like you highlighted with the Greenprint tool. And then for conservation agencies and organizations, the tool has built in the rare species that are in the Bay Area, and so that can just be used to identify overall species richness, the richness or number of species in the landscape, as well as generate species level reports for a given conservation site. So if conservation organizations are eyeing a potential acquisition, they can use this tool to look for species, rare species that might be present, sensitive habitats, as well as all the information that's in the Bay Area Greenprint. And so as we talked about, this is a great opportunity to use the tool to figure out how mitigation projects can help provide a funding stream for conservation priorities that agencies have already identified. So specifically, if conservation organizations know of a project and they can maybe market that project as having mitigation value for species and help kind of generate some interest in supporting that project from different maybe infrastructure agencies or others who are needing mitigation. So next slide. So with that, I think we're going to go ahead and put in the chat a poll, a quick poll, just designed to help us get information about the participants in this webinar, what you think about the mitigation tool, and also this webinar itself. We're anticipating doing more of these, and we'd like to know if this was helpful. So if you can go ahead and use the chat feature, the poll that just popped up, hopefully for you, to answer a couple quick questions, that would be great. And then while we do that, I think I'll turn back over to Liz, who I think is going to see if there's more questions that have came up during the demo that we can answer.
Great, thank you, Jody. You'll see another question pop up in just a second, but while we're waiting for that, some more questions came in. So first question is, if more fine scale information is available at the local level, can it be integrated? So unfortunately, it can't. We took pains to bring in the data that is consistent region-wide, and that is also a feature of the Bay Area Greenprint. However, you can take the work that you've done through the Mitigation Wizard, and then you can compare it with more fine-scale data, and we would encourage that. One of the questions earlier about, will the regulatory agencies just accept it, what you've produced? And I think that question really is important for the agencies, because I think they want to see data that is available if it's more fine scale. However, you can essentially set the table and identify the co-benefits and the other opportunities that you've created through the Mitigation Wizard. Second question is, who is in charge of RAMP and who can we get more information from? So the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the State Coastal Conservancy are essentially co-sponsoring the effort and initiative. And it's still in development. As I mentioned, the science, the data, the framework, the methods are fairly well developed, but I think more work needs to be done to work on kind of the construct and the mechanism and the funding that will go to it. In terms of who you can get more information from, you can contact me, and I'm helping facilitate the effort. The folks at the Coastal Conservancy are in the Bay Area program, and the folks at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission are in the planning and project delivery section. Okay, next question. I'm going to skip over the next question because it was answered. Okay, next question. Wondering how this tool is anticipated to speed development of a Bay Area ramp. As I mentioned, the science and the methods have largely been developed. One of the key impediments, I think, for a Bay Area ramp is to make the data easily usable by the practitioners. And so I think as we continue to work on approval, management strategies, and funding, this can be used right away to launch really a key feature of a ramp, which is to look at mitigation at a landscape scale and be able to advance mitigation projects in advance. So now it's available, and we'd like to see it used. Okay, next question. Are the metadata available, and do they identify the source of every parameter used in the model? So one of the key features of the the Bay Area Greenprint is that the data is available and is fully available and transparent. What we do is in some instances of data, there are little I for information icons. You can hover over that to see the description, but then you can click onto that and that goes to a glossary, which then brings you to the source of the data. And so to the extent that is available and downloadable by the source, you can do that. And that was a really important feature that we include, and that applies to the Mitigation Wizard.
And there's a detailed methodology section too, and for the Mitigation Wizard. So it's, yeah, a lot of details and questions that people might have are available in the method section.
I think Carrie is bringing us up to show that it's pretty small on your screen. If you can make it a little bit larger. While Carrie is showing that, I'll just a comment from somebody most interested in water conservation and watershed protection. And so there is we did include streams, fish, wetlands, et cetera, from a mitigation perspective, but I think a lot of the information that could be useful to you is in the Greenprint once you run that through the co-benefits. Carrie, do you want to walk through what you're showing?
Sure. So this is the little I button. This would help show what all the different filters, what drives all the different filters. But then we also have some detailed methods where we can go right to the Mitigation Wizard methodology that talks about how impacts are estimated and the species model and the habitat protection models versus the habitat restoration models, and then what drives that conservation plan density layer, how the land cover layer was combined from multiple data sets. So there's a lot of detail, but if you're looking for more information, always contact us so we make sure we get all the information out to you that you're looking for.
Yeah, and briefly back to the water conservation, you can select any of the watersheds that are preloaded in the tool. You can explore it in the Mitigation Wizard, and then or go straight to the Greenprint, which also you can use to explore water conservation and watershed protection at the watershed level.
Great. So sounds like the wizard doesn't just send you to existing conservation banks with available credits. Is there a way of identifying private land holdings that are for sale or where the owner is interested in a conservation easement? It's a very good point. The only thing I could say, and we could look into it, but there are 2 regional conservation investment strategies in the region. One is in Santa Clara County, and one is in the East Bay, covering both Alameda and Contra Costa counties, and other RCISs are being contemplated. In those strategies, you do have to identify conservation banks and mitigation banks. The challenge with that is basically to be on top of available credits. So this tool is not intended to monitor for that. But to the extent, I think one thing we'll think about is if there is a way to point people to existing mitigation banks. And I know there are online tools like Ribbits and others, but I think that is a fundamental difficulty in mitigation to begin with, but I think that's a good thing for us to think about. Okay, next question. Does the database include habitat restoration projects that have been completed? Correct me if I'm wrong, but it does not.
No.
Okay.
It does allow you to identify areas of degraded habitat on existing protected lands or on non-protected lands, and that's the utility of identifying where you could do restoration, but it doesn't track existing restoration projects.
Great. Okay, next, we're going to move on. We just have a few more minutes, and those are the end of the questions. So next slide. So this is a complicated tool, but we tried to make it as user-friendly as possible. So there's a how-to document and the methods. You can find all of those kind of helpful hints and tips and tricks on the Mitigation Wizard webpage and the Bay Area Greenprint resources page. So please go to those. This webinar is third in a series. So back in October, the Conservation's Lands Network 2.0, there was an introduction to that fantastic updated tool. You can find the recording of that webinar on Together Bay Area's YouTube page or the Bay Area Greenprint resources page. And the CLN is a fundamental data layer that is baked into all of these tools. A couple weeks later, we also gave a webinar on the Bay Area Greenprint to give an overview of that tool. And you can find that recording on the Bay Area Greenprint resources page. If you forget where all of these things are, just go to the Bay Area Greenprint and you can find them on resources and you can have a look and play around. Next page. So feedback, we welcome feedback. We've gotten some great feedback today. So please provide us feedback at the info@bayareagreenprint.org email address. We are also very happy and willing to schedule a one-on-one or team training for the Mitigation Wizard, and we really would ask all of you to consider doing that. We really want to see this being used, and we want to see how it can achieve the goals that we hope to achieve through this tool. Next slide. So we want to thank our funders, the SD Bechtel Jr. Foundation, who funded much of this work, the large majority of it. We also received funding for the Bay Area Greenprint from the Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Natural Capital Projects. And final slide. This is the team. So you could see that it was a confluence of 4 organizations, the Nature Conservancy, Green Info Network, Jody McGraw Consulting, and UC Davis. Patrick Huber is on this webinar today. He did a lot of the science and the modeling, so we want to thank him. And you have our names and our email addresses. So again, please reach out to info@bayareagreenprint.org for feedback, questions, training, inquiries, etc. And thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye. I'll hover for a little bit. Thank you everybody for joining.